This video is made possible by Second Call Defense. Second Call Defense provides immediate, upfront legal protection for a member who is forced to use any legal weapon for self-defense. So protect yourself today with Second Call Defense. I did. You'll find the link in the description. Hi, I'm Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for all of your support of GunGuyTV and for me and for watching this and for doing all the things that you do for the Second Amendment. I'm super grateful for everything you do. Please do check us out on these alternative locations because obviously YouTube is kind of scary and they delete stuff. Once in a while, they delete a video. So far, they haven't deleted the channel, but you might want to check us out on Rumble, BitChute, some of these alternative places that might be better. And then here's some social media links for you. By the way, hey, I'm on Trump's thing, Truth Social, which is kind of cool. So you might check me out there. I don't think I'll get deleted there. I don't know, maybe. But you please also check out the GunGuyTV Firearms podcast. It's an audio podcast that appears on your favorite podcast player, and you will also hear it about once or twice a month, depending on how crazy my schedule is. It's even on Amazon Music for some reason. I don't know why that is. I have an interview today with Rick Travis from the California Rifle and Pistol Association. We're going to talk about the tragedy that occurred just the other day in California at a Taiwanese church. Young doctor, I'm going to call him young because he's much younger than me, young doctor, pretty much from what I read, sacrificed himself to save other people in the church. Was a very well-known guy. We want to talk about that a little bit and talk about house of worship security and the danger that houses of worship face. I don't think society is quite as well, I don't think people are quite as aware of that as they probably ought to be. So let's go talk to Rick, and we'll elaborate that on that subject just a bit more. Rick, thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. Before we get started, I want to show you a couple things and just make sure people get to see these so that they know what we're talking about. Let me get, I got to hit the right buttons here. This is what happens when you're your own producer or whatever. All right, so this is the story that we're talking about, is the California shooting that happened the other day in the Taiwanese church. Some guy showed up. I guess he was, Rick knows more about it than me, but I guess he was a lover of the Chinese Communist Party and not such a fan of Taiwanese folks. And so he went in and shot up the place. Unfortunately, he managed to kill this gentleman, who is a prominent doctor from the area, only 52 years old by virtue of this story. I think the thing that astounds me is that I had to work overtime, Rick, to find a picture of this doctor. I can find pictures of the murderer that stepped in the place and just shot people pell-mell all over the place, but I had trouble finding an actual picture of the gentleman. I think the other thing that shocks me too is, and I hear it all the time, that when something doesn't fit the narrative of the mainstream media, they ignore it. Well, now they're pretty much ignoring this story. They're looking at the one in New York, but they're ignoring this one because it doesn't fit their narrative. I couldn't find it on the mainstream media anywhere except for alternative media like Breitbart. And of course, I did find it in the Orange County media, but that was it. Anyway, I think I'm really grateful that you came out to talk about this because I know this is near and dear to your heart as it is to mine. And so let's chat about that.
Yeah, so starting off with, what happened, we have a gentleman, not a gentleman, an individual that has left his home city of Las Vegas, traveled, the 5-6 hours depending on traffic, to Laguna Woods, which used to be known as Leisure World here in South Orange County, and then committed the assault on Sunday morning on a Taiwanese church that meets there. Most of the people were in their 70s. We had some people in their 80s that were among the victims. Came in with 2 handguns, opened up, and we had Dr. Chang, who you showed the picture of just a moment ago, who is a very prominent member of the medical community and the community at large. Many, many, many lives have been touched by him. An amazing individual. And he chose to do the right thing at that time. And after a career in medicine, putting other people ahead of himself, his final act was to put his body in front of other people that would have been victims and stop the assailant. And had he not done what he done, we probably would have been looking at easily twice the number of people that would have been injured or killed. So definitely a hero. But again, like you say, there's a couple of things that strike me. One, whenever someone good does something against evil, it seems like the media is reticent to make that a national news story, which is just appalling on so many levels, because I think a lot of people are looking for heroes, and by no means am I suggesting everybody go run and get themselves killed. That's not my point. But my point is, when we do have a hero, I think as a media culture, we fail to recognize that or bring that up or talk about it or discuss it. The other problem is I feel like a lot of people, even in the Second Amendment community, do not realize the threat that faith-based properties have been in, because, something goes wrong at a school, and Joel, it could be in, the backwoods of Maine, a little schoolhouse with 5 people, something goes wrong. It is a national news story for days. And yet, over the last 20 years, we've had over 2,000 different types of incidences, assaults on what we call faith-based properties. All the different denominations of Christianity, Judaism, and even Islam that have happened here in the United States. And it is one of the most underreported issues. And I think that leads to a couple of things. One, we're not doing anything to protect those properties. But 2, it's led to a lot of people making critical mistakes that cost lives within those situations.
Well, and in Orange County, I think, is pretty pro-concealed carry, isn't it? Yes. I mean, did they have a prohibition in that church against people carrying?
Not that I know of, no.
But nobody, I mean, this guy was basically beaten with a chair or something by the pastor, and then hogtied with a cord, from what I read. Mm-hmm. So nobody shot this guy.
No.
And so one wonders, I don't know, one wonders whether the church had a security team of any kind, or whether there were people in there who were carrying firearms. I don't know the answer, but I do know that Orange County is pretty open about that.
Yeah, Orange County is open about it. There are a lot of churches and places of worship in the county, as well as the rest of California, that are in some level trying to have a security team internally. There's a multitude of different ways it looks. Some that I would argue are probably fairly effective, and others I'm not as confident to say that about. In the case of this church, they're Geneva Presbyterian, they did not have a internal security team at all. And that is the more common denominator, Joel, when you go and talk to people of the 3 big faiths that represent what the majority of people that have a faith in this country subscribe to. You'll find over and over and over again, there tends to be this attitude that when, it kind of reminds me of when you and I were both kids, which was eons ago, but when we were kids,
yeah, indeed. Yeah.
We grew up with this idea, even in some of the movies in the 80s and 90s when we were young adults, of like, oh, this is hallowed ground. And so we would go put our swords outside and, our guns or whatever, because we were meeting, and nothing bad can happen on hallowed ground. But if you really are a person of history, you realize that's not even true. I mean, even in medieval times, there were people that set each other up in churches and abbeys to do, violent things. So that tends to be a prevailing attitude to this day, that nothing bad is going to happen in a faith-based property. A good friend of mine, Jimmy Meeks, who is a former law enforcement officer, runs a group called the Sheepdog Training Series. Him and I've had some long discussions, and it's really interesting. And I'll go back to, one of the classic scenes that comes out of the Bible is at the Garden of Gethsemane, when, Jesus goes to pray on the night before, the whole series of what we call the Easter weekend starts, and just before he's given up by Judas. And what do we have? Jesus is arguing with his disciples. Why aren't you staying awake? Why aren't you keeping watch? And we know that Peter, for example, was armed. And yet, what do we do when we go into churches or mosques or synagogues? We all bow our heads, we close our eyes, because we're told at some point in our faith life that that's what you do. Yet it's not in the Quran, it's not in the Bible, it's not in the Tanakh. It's in none of those things to do that. But yet that's a man-made thing that we do that puts us in harm's way. And when you go through the stats over and over again, there are multiple times where the assailants waited till everybody was bowed in prayer to make their attack. And Sam Paredes, that you have on all the time, him and I had a discussion earlier this week. Both of our pastors, when we're going to church, knew and count on us to have our heads on a swivel and be looking around. They had no problems with that. It's like, yes, please watch. And so, that's one of the reasons I said we should talk about this, because, again, people are being caught off guard because they just don't realize evil is trying to get into these different places of worship and do severe damage.
It's not just trying, it's doing it. As you know, for many years, probably about 12 years, I think, I led the security team at my church, which is quite large. In not necessarily the individual congregation, but there's several of them throughout the county. And so each congregation, you figure, has 400 or 500 people in it, right around there. There are other churches like that are mega churches. I've consulted for some of them. Saddleback being one, and others that have, really big congregations. The tough part, it's interesting. I was thinking about Saddleback, and when we were talking earlier, and I got Kevin Robertson's book. Kevin's a really good guy, and he wrote this book, Church Security 101, some years ago. And I had a different version of it, I think, with a different cover at one point. It's an interesting book, and it's an interesting thing to work with different churches on security, because every church has its own culture. So we think that every house of worship, whether it's a synagogue or a mosque or a church, even among mosques, if you go to 5 different mosques, you'll find they have 5 different mosque cultures within that mosque. If you go to 5 different churches, even the same denomination, you're going to find that the culture is different in each one. And the same thing, I assume, is the case in synagogues. And that being the case, it's not a cookie cutter thing. Part of that is that people have different opinions about armed defense. People have different views as to how that should be applied or how it shouldn't be applied. And then we have the difference between law enforcement, security, and church security. They're completely different. Law enforcement, obviously, police officers are forward leaning. Their job is to enforce laws. That's what they do. Then you have security. Typically, they're a little bit more forward leaning. If they find you on the property you don't belong, they're booting you off the property. If they're restricting your access to things, and both law enforcement and security can be rather intimidating as a result from time to time. Church security has to be different because we don't want to chase everybody away from God. We want to invite them in. And so there's this weird sort of middle ground we have to walk, where we want to be inviting, first of all, but we also want to protect the congregation. And at the same time, not only do we want to be inviting and protect the congregation, we also are aware that people are troubled. So if you have a person who's super troubled, then you're trying to get that person to some pastoral staff. In the case of a Christian church, maybe there's some sort of substance abuse ministry or any kind of other ministry, maybe whatever. You've got different ministries for different things. Maybe there's a ministry that focuses on troubles in marriage. Whatever that case might be, you're trying to get that person to the right person. And so you're engaging with them at sometimes a longer period of time than you would otherwise if you don't know them, if you were security or law enforcement, before you take any action. The action you're going to take is different. And at the same time, you're generally closer than you would be if you were law enforcement or security, where you're maintaining that field interview distance and that FI stance, that field interview stance. You may not be doing that. And then we always have the tendency to want to pray with people. And this is where it's very difficult to get people to stop praying with people like this, as you said, bowing your head, closing your eyes, rather than praying with people looking at that person. It's okay for them to bow their head. In fact, many times in the security team, I've trained my team to say, well, let's bow our heads because the other person will, and then you don't have to. And now you can keep an eye on that individual. So there's a whole balance there that is a much more difficult balance to achieve. Some churches do it really well. Some churches don't. And some churches are less concerned about everything I talked about, and they're more militaristic about and more law enforcement-y or security about their security type thing. So it just depends on the culture. I've consulted for a bunch of different churches. So far, I have not found 2 that were the same in that regard. They all look at those things differently. Some commonality that I've seen, though, is that in every church you have a group of people who don't think that security is necessary, don't think anything's going to ever happen, and in some cases just don't want it, even if something does happen. And then you have a group of people who feel very strongly about it on the other side. And then you have the ones in the middle who, for lack of a better term, are rather agnostic on it. They don't care one way or the other. They just don't. They'd rather have it out of sight, out of mind. And if you have a church that is leaning toward the I don't want it, we don't need it, the problem with that is that they then become the victim of choice because it's a path of least resistance. If you have the church over here that's heavily into it, sometimes that can chase members of the church away, or it can chase people away from actually becoming part of your church or synagogue or mosque. And then you have the people in the middle who really don't like it. They kind of don't want it. Even these people over here don't want it. But when something happens, they want it. It's sort of like you mentioned sheepdogs. Sheepdogs are not popular with sheep. I've written a whole article about this on the PDS. Actually, I think it's on the GunGuyTV website. I'll post a link to it, about sheep, wolves, sheepdogs, and porcupines. Sheepdogs are not particularly popular with sheep. Sheep don't like sheepdogs because they're intimidating. This is why we chastise police officers and then we complain when they don't show up on time. So anyway, I'm sorry, I've talked way too much, but this is just stuff about church security that I think people ought to know and ought to think about. There's so many churches out there that are making zero effort at this. And, this doesn't always happen to the church down the street.
Yeah. Well, growing up, my only comment to what you just said was growing up raising sheepdogs on a ranch.
Yeah.
I will tell you, the sheep never were fond of the sheepdog, except when they were under attack as a flock. It was amazing how fast that flock could get formed behind the sheepdog.
Right. And that's so true even among human beings.
Right.
It's so true among human beings. And then sometimes the other thing I've seen is you have the churches where the leadership is not really invested in it. They're okay with the fact that Jim and Joe and Bill and Sally all have concealed carry permits and they're sitting in different parts of the church, but they don't want to have any kind of organized security. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with having those four folks sitting around is just fine and dandy, except that it's not a very effective model. When you get right down to it, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong with that. In fact, the list of things that can go wrong with it is quite a bit longer than the list of things that can go right.
Exactly. So one of the things that you brought up, though, that I think is important is we bring something, I argue, from the home into the place of worship, and we fail to discuss it as a community, whether it's about home. And I know the minute I say this, you're going to be like, yeah, because you train on this all the time, Joel. And that is, even in the home, you have differences of opinions of how to protect your home, how to protect your family when you go camping, when you go shopping, when you do things. And I think anybody that doesn't look at society today and realize if your head's not on a swivel, you're in trouble. Historically, parents in a family realized that their issue was to make sure their family was safe at all costs. And we have relinquished that to false things that we think could actually do it. You and I both talked about law enforcement. I talk about the emergency medical system. We live under this attitude that when something goes wrong, there's enough other people to take care of us. We don't have to have that responsibility. But the fact is, whenever something really bad happens, there is not even a Band-Aid to take care of a few of us that's actually out there. How I personally got involved in this, I never thought about it growing up, going to church, going to, different events, and basically it was one of those people that lived my life, even going through historic, Christian gatherings, like at a Knott's Berry Farm or at Disneyland here in Southern California. Never, ever once thought about my safety. It's like I paid my fee like everybody else and I'm going to have a good time. And I hate to say it, but a lot of times I went to church, had the exact same mental attitude. And then when Charleston happened back in 2015, started to think about it. We held a couple of get-togethers from CRPA with some different faith-based leaders and said, how big of an issue is this? And trying to figure out how prepared were California faith-based organizations. That obviously happened on the other side of the country. And it was amazing. We had about 60 different people from across the state. Some had drove all the way down from Modoc for that first meeting, and which is, if you don't know, it's the northernmost eastern corner of the state. And everybody brought up the point of yeah, we've talked about this, sometimes the church leadership or a group of other pastors that got together, but no one had done anything, really anything. And then I had a meeting with the sheriff out of Fresno, Margaret Mims, a fantastic lady who's retiring this year. And we had a phone call set up for something completely away from this subject matter. And so I'm calling her up, and that happened to be on a Sunday, and it was right after the Sutherland Springs shooting in Texas. 26 dead, just horrific thing. And so before we went to start the conversation off, just like a lot of us do, you obviously talk about the news subject of the day. And I'm like, so what are your thoughts on this morning? And she's answering, and we're going back and forth. And I don't know if you've ever had this moment, Joel, but you're like a third of the way in the conversation, you're like, wait a second. We're not talking about the same thing. And so I just kind of put on the brakes, and I'm like, Sheriff Mims, what are you talking about? She goes, well, what you're talking about, the shooting today in Fresno. And I'm just like, what? And quickly, because when I have my computer right next to where I take my phone in my office, and I'm like, nothing. There was nothing in the news media. And she's like, yeah, guy walked into our church parking lot and killed 2 people in the car while they were praying. And I was like, holy cow, like this is now not 26 people dead at a faith-based property. This is 28, 2 different states. And then I had this question of like, well, how big is this? Like, is this just a weird day? And that's when I, started to connect with a guy named Carl Chen, who he himself had been both the victim of when Focus on the Family, which is a ministry out of Colorado Springs, was assaulted by people. And then later on, he was involved in a shooting at a church where he was a pastor at. So he started collecting all the data. And when him and I sat down, I was surprised and not surprised. And I think what I mean by that is I wasn't surprised at the staggering number. I was surprised of how glaring it was that the media was not covering it. And as a result, our respective communities, both the Second Amendment community, the faith-based community, and parts of that intersect, are almost blinded because the media has done a complete blackout of the stats and information. And like even in our state of California, if I was to say that somebody came into a preschool and murdered a couple of people, that, as you and I both know, you would hear nothing but that is front and center in the statewide and possibly national media for days. I would be looking at, along with Roy up in the legislature, at least a half a dozen bills being gutted and amended to address the issue because they're going to correct it. Yet, in a 1-year time period, we had a pastor, while they were preparing their sermon, somebody come in and say, yeah, I just need to see the pastor for a few minutes. Are you okay with that? Church secretary says, yeah. She leaves for the day, comes back by because she drives on the way home from her grocery shopping by the church, sees the pastor's car still there, think that's weird on a Friday, walks in. The pastor was writing a sermon on protecting the flock when he was stabbed to death by that person that came in for that last minute appointment. Did it make the news? Yeah, the local paper, but never made the statewide news. And then just a few weeks later, another pastor was strangled to death on a Wednesday night before Wednesday night services in her office. And, I've had all sorts of different things that if any of these had taken place in a school, Joe, it would have been everywhere. But because it's on a faith-based property, it doesn't become a news story. And part of what the CRPA and the messaging of our sheepdog program has been is just the wake-up call of realizing that this happens all the time. Every denomination is impacted by it, and that people need to start thinking in terms of, what have I told my family to do? The old days of, a few years ago, you and I would have told a crowd, take cover. Take cover doesn't work anymore. We have people now that if you're taking cover, you're still going to get shot because you just became an easier target. It's that whole thing of, fight, flight, or freeze, the 3 Fs that happen in the human psyche in this. And if you're not thinking and gaming it out to a degree of, hey, while I'm shopping, while I'm at home, while I'm worshiping, I need to keep my head somewhat on a swivel, and I need to be thinking, if this happens, what are me and my family going to do? And
well, I'll tell you how long people are going to worry about it. For a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
This has now happened. If you are watching local media or you're watching the show, you know about it. I think the gentleman you were talking about actually posted those stats on a website, if I remember correctly. So I'll post a link for that if you're watching this, and I will publicize the tar out of that so that you can read those statistics on your own. You'll be shocked. But what'll happen is what happens at churches all the time. I would show up to church after a shooting like that, and people would come up out of the woodwork to walk up to me or walk up to one of my team members and ask us, "Now, you guys are carrying guns, right? You guys can deal with this, right? I mean, if this happens, you guys are ready to protect us, right?" And that would go on for a week or two. And then when it came time to talk about security, the pastor wasn't particularly interested in talking about that, or the team wasn't, we were trying to get different things. I mean, it was just tough. It was tough to get anybody to pay attention to it until something happened. It was always closing the barn door after the horses got loose.
Right.
And that's something we've got to, as a faithful community, whether you're Muslim or Hindu or Jewish or Christian, it really doesn't matter from the standpoint of what we're talking about here. As a faithful community, we've got to start protecting our places of worship and our worship leaders. And we've got to figure out a way to do that doesn't conflict with our faith. And at some point, we've got to support the people who are doing that, not just after a church shooting, within the immediate aftermath of that, but on an ongoing basis. This is not getting better.
No.
They're getting worse. They're happening more often. You're just not hearing about them because, as Rick said, they're not posting them in the mainstream media. Look, Biden and his wife go to a shooting that just happened because they want the publicity. Maybe it really troubled them, or maybe they just needed the photo op. But did they go to the one that happened at the church? No. They go to the one the media is talking about, because the media is not talking about the one that happened at the church in California. They're talking about the one that happened in New York. And that's the problem. That's the problem. It doesn't make the airwaves, except on alternative media, local media, and goofball shows like this one. So we've got to start taking it much more seriously.
I also would argue we have to start you and I don't have enough hands or toes, nor if we combine all the members of our family, we still want to have enough for the number of times, Joel, you and I'd almost argue some of the time when we've been together in the same place at SHOT Show and others, have heard, when is our community going to get to hear the story about the good person who did the right thing at the worst of times? And here's an example. I know a lot about Dr. Chang. He trained regularly at a friend's, two different training centers. He, incredible member of the medical community here, touched upon literally thousands of lives, very active in his faith, very active in a lot of other things. He had choices to make a week ago, and he made the one to save other lives. He stood up even without his sidearm on him and rushed towards the attacker, not away. And arguably, like I said before, many more people would have been injured and possibly lost their lives had he not done that. But he gave the distraction and the impact that enabled the older pastor to be able to pick up a chair and hit the assailant on the back of the head, which put him to the floor where other people could hog tie him. We need to be pushing out, like, where's the recognition for this? We will have other people that don't have great backgrounds, that don't do necessarily a lot for their community, that will pass away under interesting conditions. I'll just be polite that way. And they will become national icons because different communities within our American culture will push for that. We tend to stand silent when we have a hero like Dr. Chang, who did the right thing and gave up his life to preserve others. And we're like, unfortunately, like what you said, we're like, oh, wow, yeah. And then 2 weeks later, we let it go by, but then we will gripe for the next 3 years around range reloading tables, at get-togethers. Well, where is that person? Well, that person's not remembered because there's an old adage my grandfather taught me: you're alive as long as people are still talking about you. You're being remembered. It's when everybody forgets who you were that it's over. And I think this is a time period where we need to be pushing out this narrative of, look, one of our own, a respected member of his community in every facet of his life, did the right thing, and we're not going to forget him. And I think just as easy as we make patches and other things up for stuff, I think we should not be forgetting this individual. And I think we should also be using this negative experience as a wake-up call in our community and keep the conversation going.
I want to put his picture up. I put it while you were talking. I put it up for a minute. I want to put it up again because I think you're right. As I said, I've searched the media all over the place, Rick, and I can find pictures of the shooter all over the place. I actually it took me about 20 minutes of searching to find a picture of this doctor. He didn't have to do what he did. He could have run the other way. He could have been, like everybody else who was hiding, if anybody was hiding. I don't know. I wasn't there. But he could have been trying to find cover to get behind. I assume that he had a family. He could have been trying to protect his family to get them behind cover or whatever. But he didn't do that. And the idea that he actually charged the attacker to give other people time to do something is quite extraordinary. And as you say, not even the media. I've still got his picture up, okay, because I want people to burn this guy's image in their head.
Well, let me tell you just a couple of broad brushstrokes about the gentleman. He is a family man, has sons and daughters in school. I believe high school, one may be in junior high, but I know at least two of them are at the high school level. Great marriage by all accounts, very active in his community. He, along with a partner, founded one of the biggest medical groups of doctors and nurses to treat people in South County, very well respected, was very instrumental in saving, I would argue, well over 1,000 lives during the pandemic. Just incredibly dedicated person that if you were to look at people that society would often say had much more to lose than to gain by doing this, this man is the epitome of that. I mean, it's a horrible loss to the medical community just alone. Literally the patients, what we've even heard at the CRPA and working with a couple other people on this, literally thousands of people's lives have been touched by this man just over the past couple of years, that he's no longer there for them as a resource or anything else. This was a doctor that didn't just show up at work and say, okay, I did my 6 hours, I'm going to go play golf. This was a guy who was connecting with people, having personal lunches with people, and people like you and I who don't necessarily want a doctor's time in that manner, unless you're like really close personal friends. But whatever he could do for the community, both the Second Amendment community, the medical community, his faith community, he did. He was that guy that went above and beyond. And so back to your statement earlier, I can give you probably a good 25 reasons why to try to preserve his life rather than sacrifice it for the gain of the people in that congregation. And yet he chose the latter.
It's sad to me, and I don't want this to be a referendum on that church or whatever, but it is sad to me when people like this gentleman have to do, what he chose to do. Somebody was going to have to do that probably if they were going to keep the number of injuries and deaths down. Mm-hmm. They were reduced to fighting a shooter with a chair and imposing a human body between the shooter and the potential victims. They were reduced to hog tying the guy with an extension cord. And again, without this, I'm not trying to pick on that church, but I think we have to talk about this stuff. Of a house of worship, in my humble opinion, the congregants there, regardless of the faith being celebrated, should not be in a position where the best defense they can mount against an armed killer with a gun is a chair and an extension cord and an incredibly courageous man, unarmed. That is part of the tragedy here, in my view, and I'm curious what your thoughts are.
My thoughts go a couple different ways. One, I want to point out very clearly, and I know I get accused of being up on the legislature all the time, and I'm just going to say that's part of my job. And I'm not going to deny it. But here's the part that is really disturbing to me. We have anything, like I said, goes on to school, and we have multiple bills that are being gutted and amended, meaning bills that were designed for solar energy also become yet another bill on the Second Amendment community, which if you actually stop and pause when you see these, anybody with common sense would look and go, that wouldn't change anything. I can give, a recent shooting resulted in a gun amendment bill that said, oh, we're going to post more signage at ranges. The bad guys don't go to those ranges. So what good would that signage have? It wouldn't have done nothing to stop the, range signs not going to stop a mass shooting. And you know that as well as I do. But we're not even seeing that when it comes to these types of acts. And when people look at the stats that you put inside this video, they're going to know right off the bat, like, holy cow, like, we're doing nothing on this. And part of that is government's fault, but a good chunk of that's our fault, mine included. Like, we need to keep pushing on this out there, because we should have the right to go somewhere and not have to look over our shoulder. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. And we need to realize that, everybody has a right to defend themselves, but we need to be talking like, okay, if this happens, this is what we're going to default to. This is what we're going to do, but we're not doing it. We're not looking at Hollywood and saying, why aren't you educating your public through your different TV shows on this subject like you do every other subject? Because there's people of every faith that are being put in harm's way. And part of it is having the conversation you and I are having. I belong to a couple of different big churches, a couple of small churches. I'm with a different church group right now. But, how do you handle that issue when it comes up? And like you said, no one has the exact same plan. A lot of times, even plans that may look good haven't always been discussed with the various responders that would respond to that incident, which can, as you and I both know, can cause issues both during and post the actual tragic incident. We just tend not to want to talk about this stuff, but it's like everything else in life. You got to talk about cancer if you don't want to get it, or you want to be able to handle it when you do, so you don't lose your life to it. This is a cancer in our society. It's a cancer attacking faith-based networks, and putting our head in a sand or in a hole and acting like it's not there, those days are way back in the rearview mirror down the road. It is here. It is attacking us. It is lethal, and we've got to do something about it. And that starts with what you and I are doing right now, Joel. Conversations, keeping us alive, going, who all do I talk to? And I don't know I have some friends who are Muslim. I have a very good friend who's a rabbi, much younger than you and I, which is good, because it means I know that we'll have rabbis in the future. And a lot of Christian friends. We don't all go to the same place of worship, but by golly, we need to be talking together and saying, okay, how do we do symposiums? How do we do different things to get the public engaged and keep it going? This cannot be what I call, as a former medic, the earthquake response of, well, we had an earthquake. Everybody go buy your first aid kit on sale at the local, supermarket, and I'm prepared. No, there's several flaws in that plan already, but and it's like, I look at COVID and I talk to people all the time. I say, in survival train, everybody went and bought toilet paper and water. You couldn't find either one of those things. Yeah. Now they're both there, but the threat's not gone. And I'm not talking about COVID. Of anything, you still need to have that water in reserve, right, in different items, because you're not always going to get the nice warning from the President of the United States, we're shutting down in 3 days. You're not going to get that one. It's just going to happen.
I think you made a great point. We should not be forced by our government. We shouldn't have a choice forced upon us to go places without the means with which to defend ourselves. Right. Everybody has the right to defend themselves, and these folks at this church did. This doctor defended the people at the church by imposing his body in between the shooter and them. The pastor defended the people in the church by swinging a chair. Some other members defended the church by using an extension cord to hogtie the guy. And I think that's incredible what they did. And I don't want to in any way minimize the courage that it took to do that. But this is the year 2022. We should not be artificially limited to chairs and extension cords and imposing our bodies. If we have the right to defend ourselves against violence, we need the implements with which to do that.
Right.
And we need law enforcement and government to get the heck out of the way so that we can do that. Like I said, in Orange County, it's less of an issue perhaps, but nevertheless, you still have to get a permission slip. San Diego County, it's less of an issue, but you still have to get a permission slip. And then even in the state of California, if you're a church and you happen to be meeting that weekend on one kind of a property or another kind of a property, it may not be legal for you at that moment to carry a firearm on that property because of the way the laws are structured in the state of California. And I'm not going to talk about what kinds of properties because I don't want to give any bad guys any ideas. So don't do it, okay? But nevertheless, those issues do exist. This stuff is only going to change, and particularly in the faith community, if the faith community starts getting loud about it. Mm-hmm. And if we're super vocal about it, and if we make sure that legislators know that outside of just blatantly cheating to stay reelected, they don't have the chance of a snowball in hell of getting reelected if they don't get to where they act on this stuff, so people can defend themselves when they go to synagogue or mosque or church or whatever, or for that matter, to the supermarket.
Right. I completely agree. I think that's one of the issues is we've allowed government, especially the political side of it, because the bureaucracy just slugs through whatever it chooses to slug through. But the political side, just looking between Southern California, just totally bring this down. We had the shooting there at the synagogue in San Diego. It was a big deal for a couple of weeks, faded away. We have one that's in a public dance place, big issue for a couple of weeks, fade away. The entire community has to say enough's enough. And it's not like people are going down the street to the gun store, which is the narrative, and buying something and immediately creating mayhem. These are people that are sick and doing it. And you ask anybody in law enforcement, you ask anybody in emergency medicine. I never had a crystal ball that said, oh, Joel's going to have a medical issue. Could you be there by 1 o'clock? I got the call that always said, Joel has an active medical issue. He's possibly dying. Can you get there in time to save him? What people don't realize is they think of it of, no, somehow we know where we got to be. We could be on a completely different area. It's going to take us longer. It's going to delay us. There could be other people because it's a big community and we're not going to get there in any time soon. Forget about a golden hour. This is not going to happen. And then that's why we say, you never hear somebody say, oh, well, a workplace shouldn't have a first aid kit or shouldn't have a automated external defibrillator or shouldn't have, because the politicians realize, no, we need to pass laws that make it permissible to have those things throughout society. And that's why when you go into a movie theater, now there's ADs. I know when I started out as a medic, there were none of those things. And there was a lot of pushback when they first became available, but it only took a few people dying for the government to go, we need to get the hell out of the way and let that go out there for insurance and costs and everything else and to try to avoid lawsuits. This is where our community needs to really start pushing as a whole and saying, look, law enforcement is spread, as you said, and I have a son who's a police detective. He would tell you the same thing every day. They're incredibly thin. Yeah. They can't be everywhere. That's why they don't say we're there to protect. They're there to respond and hopefully find the people that did this. But even that, without getting political, has a lot of issues in this day and age. So there is no barrier but you and your family and your community to stand up to evil. And not everybody's going to want to carry a gun. I get that, but we need to have the discussion about it. We need to try to engage. And you brought up a really good model that I use all the time. There's probably 5 to 10% arguably within the faith-based community that are like, no firearms, Joel, no security team, nothing. And there's probably an equal percentage on the other side, which leaves about 80% in the middle. And I wouldn't go so far as saying agnostic as I would apathetic. They're kind of like, okay, well, if I don't have to be involved, do what you got to do. It's that 80% in the middle that we've got to wake up. And I pose it this way, and this is probably going to come off really harsh, but I've been doing this for a couple of years. If you're in that 80% listening to this video and thinking, okay, I hear where you guys are coming from, but I just don't know. Ask yourself this one question. The bad thing happened this last weekend at your place of worship. Can you look at yourself in the mirror and said, I, as a part of that community, did everything I could have, at least vocally, to say we should have been better prepared? And if so, some things are just what they are. They're just really bad incidences. But I would remark that the vast majority of that 80%, they can't do it. And the regret you will live with is horrific. And I know, because I know several people, having done this since 2015, that they have deep, deep regrets and have had to even go get some assistance to deal with those regrets because they didn't speak out after they've been warned. We've all been warned. None of us can walk away and say we didn't know this was a thing.
Well, if you're watching this and you haven't been warned before, you've been warned now. Rick, I can't tell you how many people have walked up to me at church over the years, or at churches where I've gone and spoken, because the churches, had me come out to speak, where people have walked up and said, well, I don't believe that we should do this. We should just trust God. Mm-hmm. And I'm, me, one of my favorite scriptures is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. So I go, just as you do every day in my life, trusting in the Lord. But the Lord gave me something between my ears that I should use. And so I generally ask these people, okay, I understand. So you don't want to have any firearms at church because you want to trust in the Lord to defend you. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Did you wear your seatbelt when you were driving here to church this morning? Well, yeah. What's wrong, bro? How come you don't just trust in the Lord? Do you have a fire extinguisher in your kitchen or in your garage? Well, yeah. Well, then what's the problem? Why don't you just trust in the Lord? This is the ridiculous mindset that we get is, I'm just going to trust in God in this one area, but in every other area, it's okay for me to wear a seatbelt, have a fire extinguisher, have medical insurance, have auto insurance, and have homeowners insurance, and lock my doors when I go to bed at night. I ask him, do you lock your doors when you go to bed at night? Yeah. Why do you do that? Why don't you just trust in the Lord? Certain things we seem to want to have this bizarre, all of a sudden we become these people who are going to trust in the Lord in that one area, but in every other area, no, we just do that because these are all accepted as the norm, and that one is not. And we have an issue with that. We've got to get past that mode of thinking and recognize that God gave us a 3-pound brain or whatever it weighs between our ears. As my dad used to say, use your head for something besides holding your ears apart. And he gave us the ability to take steps to secure ourselves and prepare for our own safety and protect God's people or our families or whatever the case might be. And oftentimes we don't want to do it. One of Pete's favorite stories is the guy who's in the middle of the hurricane and the water's rising. Yeah. And he says, God, come save me. God, come save me. And a cop comes by and drives by and says, get in the car. Let's get you out of here. The water's going to rise. And he says, no, okay. God will save me. God will save me. And then the water keeps rising. And pretty soon a guy in a boat comes by and says, jump in the boat. Let's get you out of here. And of course he says, no, God will save me. And it isn't long before he's sitting on top of the peak of his roof, and that's all he's got left. And a helicopter comes by and tries to throw him a ladder to climb on. Come on, we'll get you out of here. No, it's okay. God will rescue me. And he ends up drowning. And then when he gets to heaven, he says, God, how come you didn't save me? He says, what are you talking about? I sent you a cop. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter.
Right.
We've got to get out of this, what I'm going to call not just a foolish, but a stupid argument, and begin to take this threat seriously.
It goes to a lot of what you're saying, and I attack it a little differently, but I do use Pete's thing because that's a famous thing that we've used as medics too, that joke. But it comes back to checking our brain at the door is what I call it. And it's amazing because I don't care what faith-based group you go to or cultural group. It's always amazing to me the different minds and the different backgrounds and different expertises that assemble in a room, whether it's up 30 people or 300 people. And if you go to those people and say, do you have a security mechanism? Even if you're a software engineer, yeah, we've got bots, we got this, we got that to handle if there's a security threat, fire extinguishers, like we can go through the long list and probably do a whole show on all those things. And I'm like, so why do you do it in all those cases? Well, we got to secure property, personnel, we have name badges, we do all that kind of stuff. Then do you not see that rather, even if you just go back to the founding 5 books that all 3 of the big faiths use, it is replete with story after story of people becoming prepared to do what God would call them to do at a later date. Like that is just a reoccurring theme that backs up what you just said. And yet when you look at people and you go, well, did you ever think that you went to college, you went through all these experiences in the workplace and in life to prepare you to do the right thing in this community? And yet when you walk through the back door or the side door or the front door, it's like you take this thing called the brain out and you put it on a shelf and don't bring it in with you. Whereas if everybody brought their brains to the table and said, why aren't we doing here what we do in all these other parts of our lives? 1, and 2, we all demand that, hey, if something bad happens, we should have insurance that will pay to replace and repair when something bad happens. We have all sorts of mechanisms that we have fought for as a people with our government to have. And true, some of those have financial cost to them. I'm not arguing that, but they're available. You got to look at faith-based properties, what's available. And with the exception of good people like you, the limited capacity at CRPA and other 2A groups like Gun Owners of California have to try to warn people and get them talking and discussing, we got a lot of work to do. And part of it is waking people up to say, wake up, because this is a serious issue. And if we don't, it's going to get worse, because it has. I mean, if you go back to those stats, Carl Chen and Faith Based Network have done a great job of tracking what has been in the media. And that's the last thing I'll say. When you look at that stats, Carl will tell you that's what they've been able to get from law enforcement and from the media, which is grossly underreported.
You've got a member of a church or perhaps a pastor or somebody at a church, and they don't know where to begin. What's a good way for them to begin to take this seriously?
First thing is to connect to a conference or to somebody like you does train, or even some things that we put on at CRPA to start the discussion, to start to see what your options are. Because like you said, every church is like every family. They have different operations, different emotions and feelings and stuff like that. The second thing too is also to look at for all the bad that's happened, we've had some amazing people in multiple parts of this country stand up and step up. I think back to, I can't remember her name off the cuff, but an amazing young lady who was a security guard that does a lot of what you do in the side business. She had been on, I think if I remember the story right, like a 12-hour shift, which is, I know from being in emergency medicine, that's grueling. You're exhausted afterwards. To her credit, she decided to go to church. She walked into the church when a couple of armed gunmen came in with assault rifles to do damage. And she got up with a pistol and out loud walked towards the person, a revolver versus an AR. Not a good tactical situation, but she walked towards them and said, Holy Spirit, don't let me miss. And she won the day and saved her congregation. The governor in Colorado was very forward thinking and awarded her a medal from the state for what she did that morning. But that was someone who is indicative of putting their entire faith in God and in their training simultaneously when confronted with the worst of society and evil. And I think pastors have to equally show, and imams and rabbis, both of those things to at least their congregational leadership and say, this is the world we live in. We want to breed a culture that's more like this lady or this or Dr. Chang or something else than we do just lie in wait for the bad thing to happen. And then I think it's all of us bringing those resources. I mean, we have an incredible amount of knowledge in this community that could help keep people safe and alive. And We got to start dedicating ourselves to bringing what we know in our contacts to bear to help people. We tell people all the time they can reach out to us at contact@crpa.org. We still get stuff all the time from different faith-based organizations and even people that just meet in homes to help them with that. But that's an issue that we have to be able to mobilize and move forward and not let this man's life go in vain. We need to remember that he put all on the line. And so for any of us that sit there and think we don't need to do something, we do need to do something. We beat up on people enough in this show on that, and I agree. But I also think we need to celebrate those that have done the right thing, whether it cost them their life or not. And we need to go have conversations starting off with our faith-based leadership and say, look, this is a sensitive issue. It's no more sensitive than many issues that are discussed in faith-based organizations dealing with interpersonal relationships, marriages, what that particular organization or group is or isn't going to do in a community. Those are all sensitive issues. So we're not unfamiliar with them, but we need to have the conversation, and we need to say at the end of that conversation, have we moved the ball forward into protecting our flock? I'd also recommend you can go to Sheepdog Safety, you can go Faith-Based Network America. I know you'll have a couple of those down there. And look, many of them have affiliate groups that work with churches across the country and synagogues and,
and Rick and I'll talk after the show, and I'll get those links. So I'll put them in the description for you. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put them in the comments and pin them to the top. I can't do that in the other places. So that way, if you want to reach out to those folks, you can do that, and that will help you. Anything else we should mention? Any last words, Rick?
No, I missed seeing you for a while, so this is good.
Well, I'm glad we did it. Thank you very much for coming on. This has been a long interview and a long talk, but I think it's worthwhile, and I'm hoping that people will watch it all the way through. I guess we'll find out, huh? Have a great week. Thank you very much for watching the whole video. I'm very grateful that you stuck with it all the way through. I know sometimes these can be kind of long, but it's important that you have the information. And I think it's important that we talk about some of this stuff that a lot of folks don't want to talk about. So I'm very grateful that you hung in there the entire way. If you'd like to support California Rifle and Pistol Association, there is a link in the description. I suggest that you do that. Likewise, if you'd like to support GunGuyTV, you can always join GunGuyTV crew. There's a link in the description for that as well. Or you can just find us on Locals, or you can find us on Patreon, either place, whichever one you like better. Or you can just go to GunGuyTVcrew.com. Have a great week. Thank you very much for everything you do. And wherever you go, whatever you do, be safe.